Hello, my name is Chris Snipes, and you are listening to The Melt. The word occult is often associated with evil or the Satanic, when in reality it means hidden or not revealed. There are many reasons for hiding something or concealing it, and often within the context of magical secret societies, it was often the case that the ancient secrets which these groups claimed to have in their possession could only be accessed through an elaborate maze of initiations. There have been many waves of interest in the occult throughout history. The last few have included the 60s, when the psychedelic movement sometimes inspired its participants to expand outside of the realm of their often conservative Christian upbringings to encompass esoteric philosophies and practices from the East and from various occult groups of the early 1900s, such as the Golden Dawn and the OTO, and occult practitioners such as Aleister Crowley and Austin Osman Spare. There was also an occult psychedelic renaissance that began in the late 80s and has been gaining momentum up until the present day. Today's guest, author and filmmaker Carl Abrahamsson, has documented all of this and much more in his book Occulture, The Unseen Forces That Drive Culture Forward. I start off the conversation by asking Carl if he thought that the psychedelic movement of the 60s helped to revitalize an interest in the occult.
Yeah, I do to an extent. It's not the only factor involved, but I certainly believe it because you could say that there's one term or one key concept that is central to both these things. And of course, a psychedelic movement, it's a lot of things. Occultism is a lot of things, but they both have the core of the mind, the human mind. So in that sense, expanding the mind or exploring the mind, that's always been a human fascination, since forever. And in any intelligent culture has that as a predominant central part. And I think what happened in the psychedelic so-called movement was that it was like a crash course. Anybody could explore for $1, and go, finding things out. I think mostly in a kind of beneficial way. Some people have voiced criticism about sort of the irresponsibility of confusing a fun internal mental ride in a way with deep soul searching and have some kind of tangible like spiritual value, but I don't think it's for anyone else to criticize what someone else experiences. And I think that the interesting thing about that time and about what happened basically in people's minds was that when they tried to formulate a language or a terminology to describe what they had experienced, they realized that language is not really adequate uh, enough for certain things, and this was one such thing. But when exploring that kind of terminology and trying to find like a common language in a way, uh, instead people talked about ideals and things that were not good in the outer, and that led to many very important movements in specifically in American culture, American society. Civil rights was parallel to that, women's lib parallel to that, ecological thinking parallel to that. So what bloomed from this chaotic initial phase of the 60s basically turned into more perhaps substantial and important things, because everyone who dares will always try to find out more about him or herself. That's just inherent in the human mind, in a way,
Absolutely.
human program. But I think that people realized that they could change a lot simply by doing things together. That, I think, was based on the fact that they tried to find a common language to sort of interpret and share this, magnificent, majestic, and sometimes perhaps terrifying experience that the psychedelic journey was and is.
Absolutely, especially in the 60s when
Yeah.
a lot of those kids kind of grew up in the conservative 50s.
Exactly, and I think if we want to carry on with the sort of comparing it to the occult or occultism, sort of historically, is that I think it's always been looked upon in the same kind of way. The classic archetype of the magician is kind of a loner, but it stems from the shamanic archetype, someone who goes, exploring in his or her mind and comes back with some information that's vital for the little tribe or the little society. And I think that's an incredibly important archetype. And I don't see it as being gone either. It's just taken on different kinds of forms. It's no longer one weird person with like a pointed hat or a drum, or it's just other people who are doing things culturally instead, and bringing back sort of oracular visions and information. The question today is whether anyone listens, because everyone is so fragmented and not caring about substantial things, because it's all about instant thrills, instant little gratifications. So we have yet to see, or people in the future will be the evaluators of our time today. But I think it's an incredibly interesting time. But unfortunately, I'm a little bit dystopic or dystopian, in the sense that I think this fragmentation, specifically in the younger generations, will be horrible for their and for future generations' ability to interpret information. Because if it isn't like hacked up in very palatable small doses, then they can't see any big pictures, and that's a huge problem.
Exactly, and there's absolutely no vetting process whatsoever for something like the
No,
internet.
no,
Yeah,
no, no,
and
no.
anybody can write their manifesto on there.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And anybody, apparently, anybody can have 30 million followers, and it means
Yes.
nothing because there's nothing to follow.
Exactly, exactly. And it seems like, well, at least in the 60s, when they were coming or trying to transcend and get themselves out of the mindset of the conservative 50s, what they looked back on were the occult movements of, a few decades before them, like Crowley and
Hmm.
the Thelemites and
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, and that seemed to also happen too. There was a resurgence, it seems like in the 80s too, where people were not only looking back to Crowley, they were looking back to the 60s, but they were also some new things were being invented too, like chaos magic
Hmm.
and what else? What other important things do you think happened in the decade of the 80s?
Well, I think chaos magic was absolutely an important part of that. And then, of course, there's the things that were going on in the environment where I sort of grew up, or I had my initial training, which was the Temple of Psychic Youth, which was also, decidedly an 80s phenomenon. Um, and I think that it was very much a kind of a teenage movement, not meaning that it has to do with being for teenagers, but that a teenage psychology, in the sense that, let's look at mommy and daddy and the parents. And in this sense, in the very Western esoteric sense, that would be Crowley. That would be the Golden Dawn. That would be these sort of institutions that had a meaning, had a real meaning, in pushing sort of arcane stuff into the modern world, into modernity in a way. But then, sort of in the 80s, towards the end of the 20th century, there was the teenager coming forth and saying, I don't give a rat's ass. I want to do this thing, and I want to look at things like the mind, for instance, and shortcut and integrate in a little bit sort of political issues, not as issues, but just as an attitude of finding the power in being aggravated and being aggressive and being creative with very small means. Creativity was an important part of this, trying to not trying to, but actively working with art and artistic expressions as being magical rituals and magical talismans. That was a new thing, and that was also integrated in the chaos magic things. So this kind of pragmatic attitude, using whatever you have available, whether it's just pen and paper, for your magical workings. It doesn't need to have like fancy robes or organized hierarchical structures to be fully functional. And that was basically a great time. But you see what I'm saying? It's like this teenager saying, I'm gonna find my own way, and I'm gonna tread on my own path, and I don't care about anything. And so that was a very, very healthy kind of liberating energy around then.
Absolutely, and chaos magic was perfect for that because there wasn't any sort of strict stigma or dogma.
No.
You pick and choose from whatever belief system that you want to take on
Yeah,
at the moment.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
I was really drawn to that. Go ahead.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I'm just saying yeah, I find it incredibly healthy, because if there's one thing that not only history has shown us, but also specifically the history of occult orders and groups and things like this, it's this crazy thing called human dynamics, human group dynamics, and it doesn't end well. It never ends well. It's just an inherent problem maybe in the human psyche itself. But I mean, a society, it's kind of amazing that a society works, because there are so many people who are all trying to work together, and sometimes it works, but that works because there's the rigidity of law, and there's the law enforcement,
Yes.
actually keeping things in place with the sort of what do you call it, the right to use force in order to keep people in line. And if we're lucky, we're in good societies where it's sort of beneficial to be involved, and you feel that you have freedom of movement and thought and expression. And other places don't have that, so it's not such a good thing. But anyway, this kind of group dynamics always creates havoc in contained small groups, like for instance occult orders, um, and sort of religious movements, because um, it really kind of, it seems to bring out the worst in people. Meaning you have this possibility of personal uh, elevation, personal refinement in this occult process, whatever it may be. But at the same time, you have uh, politics, the politics of the group and the group dynamics, that quite often goes sort of head to head against the ideals and what people are actually striving for. So it sort of becomes like hypocritical resonance chambers, echo chambers, where it's just impossible to keep something going for a long time. And that's unfortunately the history of occultism to a great extent. Then, of course, you have the pioneers, the people who are sort of outside, who just want to do the work and write about it and leave it for posterity. And we should be very, very grateful to those people who have not felt the inclination or the need to integrate themselves into some kind of group simply to feel some kind of power. They have been more interested in the work itself, and I think that's a wonderful thing, and that's probably saved a lot of very, very fine and beautiful and important thoughts for posterity. Simply this thing where you avoid the group dynamics.
Well, for those listeners out there who have never heard of the Temple of Psychic Youth, TOPY for short, could you maybe describe what the philosophy of that group was?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the overall background in a way was the spirit of breaking away from traditional occultism, even traditional slash contemporary occultism, because Crowley had only died in 1947, and the Golden Dawn was by then a bunch of different splinter groups, and um, but the idea was actually very philosophically very infused with Crowley's Thelema, for sure. But there was also another strain of important thinking coming from not specifically from occult thinkers, but contemporary cultural thinkers like William Burroughs, for instance, who was not only like an avant-garde writer, he also wove in a lot of societal anti-control issues, and that was very interesting and appealed to a lot of people at the time. And the same thing with J.G. Ballard in the UK, and artists like Brian Geisen, who wove in these sort of magical concepts again in art. And looking back at surrealism and seeing what made them so fantastic was this merger of mind, magic, visual culture, and making it all basically the same thing. So that was kind of a core concept to work with these ideas. Crowley's philosophy of will, William Burroughs, and control, and cutting things up according to Brian Geisen, applying the cut-up technique to all kinds of media and also your own life. And then also working with magically with a lot of ideas and concepts coming from Austin Osman Spare, who was also a very, very influential occult thinker in the chaos magic movement. Austin Spare is like the bridge between the old and the new, in a way. Mm-hmm. And I find him incredibly stimulating thinker. And fantastic artist, of course, also. So basically, you had this thing which wasn't a magical order, but at the same time it was. So it wasn't like a philosophical think tank, but it also was. And it wasn't like simply a network for weird arcane information, but it also was that. So you have these things that sort of merged. How should I put it? It was like a cauldron in a way, where you put in these different ingredients and then sort of stirred the stew. And the beautiful thing was that immediately there was this the network was going, and if you were involved in this, you could like send out newsletters and sort of requesting information about, anybody have any information about this specific writer? I can't find any books at my library. And of course this was pre-internet, so it wasn't that easy. Now we could just Google for something or find it on Abe Books. But then suddenly, a couple of weeks later, you could find someone had sent you like a big Xeroxed pile of papers concerning information about that. That was kind of remarkable, which signaled immediate trust. Why should I take several hours to prepare material for someone over in the US that's interested in this thing? Well, it was because everybody invested that kind of energy into it. And of course, it was also a lot of cottage industry things going on, people making cassettes, people making records, people making videos, and even books and stuff too, and this very creative environment. And it's hard to say, was there something consistent in there? And I would say that it was those two things, kind of a merger between Crowley and Thelema and those strains coming from Burroughs and Geisen concerning the individual's position in a rigid, controlled society, usually a very draconian society, even in our sort of free Western sphere, still filled with draconian stuff, and they wanted to encourage people to sort of short circuit that kind of control. So that was, at least some of the main tenets or themes of the Temple of Psychic Youth.
And they even flirted around with sort of cult trappings too, right? Like some same haircuts, the symbol.
Yeah. I think that was interesting too, in the sense that it's like a two-edged sword in a way. It's kind of a criticism saying you both want and don't want a cult spreading these philosophies and working with sex magic and using psychedelic drugs and stuff like that. But hey, here we are and we look like this. So it's a kind of a sardonic, intelligent, in a way, ironic approach. But at the same time, the other, the double-edged thing is that it also becomes a real thing that people can criticize and attack. And so I think that irony perhaps fell on deaf ears, or ears that did not want to hear that thing, because they only saw what they wanted to see, and they wanted to see a cult. So, but of course not everybody was involved in that aspect of it. On the other hand, doing things like certain kinds of homogeneizations, like identical dress or style or an aesthetic, it can also be an incredibly powerful thing.
Absolutely. It's like it was like a solidarity in a sense
Yeah,
too.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And this, the psychic cross, the emblem and the symbol and stuff like that. You saw someone at concerts with that kind of patch or a badge, and you could immediately talk to those people like you don't need any. Uh, not introductions, but like a lot of things were just blown away. You could instantly connect with that the person, not because it was like a band, you could badge with a band. That's not the same thing. But the psychic cross sort of was a gateway into deeper communication because it contained so much more. It contained philosophy. It contained a sense of magic and curiosity and this psychonautical approach to life in general. So I think that cult, yeah, maybe it has, as you said, it had some cultic tendencies, perhaps, but it was all about the individual, and in the end, it sort of folded because the individuals that were running it. I was running Topi Europe at the time. Uh, we had just gotten so overwhelmed by boring administrative stuff, and sort of that's what happens when you grow something from the very, very, very beginning, is that, yeah, wow, this works, it grows, and suddenly you have mail outs and correspondence, and you're not getting paid for it. You're doing it because it's a labor of love and you believe in the ideas, but eventually there comes this thing where you just can't take it anymore, and even if people helped out and stuff, I think it was time. 10 years was the initial phase of Topi, and it sort of folded at the same time, more or less the same time in Europe and in the UK and in the US. So it's an interesting thing, almost like it was programmed in a way.
Yeah, yeah, like a time bomb or something. Not a
Hmm.
time bomb. That's not the imagery that I want, but I think time release
Yes, yes,
capsule.
yes, yeah, exactly.
What initially drew you to Topi?
I think I was at an age, and we're talking about sort of the early 80s, when I was concretely a teenager. I was born in 1966, and I was then, going to high school and being very interested in music specifically. And I listened to a lot of weird music, and of course, Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV were around, and I love that stuff in the kind of avant-garde approach that's not art for art's sake, but it was also actually filled with references and a kind of very refreshing intellectualism. It was great music, but also great ideas. And many of the ideas that when Psychic TV had begun, they had, of course, jointly been formed with the Temple of Psychic Youth. And with each Psychic TV record, there was also information about Topi, and you can subscribe to information. And I decided to do that. And then I have always been uh, I sort of sometimes call it addicted to printed matter. So I've always had some kind of fanzine going, or a magazine, or some kind of publishing effort.
Mhm.
And I did, and I had a music fanzine called Lollipop, and interviewing bands that came to Stockholm, and I traveled to the UK a great deal, and I just wrote about all these great bands that were around. And I did go to see Genesis Peorage in London in 1986, and I was already subscribing to Topi Information at the time, and I found it very interesting. And when I saw how serious and devoted they were to this work, when I visited, I realized that this is incredibly inspiring. You can do a lot of things just by having that determination, and the things that they were interested in, I was also very interested in. And I should probably mention now, because I'm actually knee deep in work, not as we speak, but these weeks, this period, finishing a book called Sacred Intent. And Sacred Intent is an anthology of all of my interviews with Genesis Peorage from that first meeting in 1986 to 2019. So this is time span there of calculation, 33 years. And it's coming out in February. So that's been a very interesting trip, to sort of see how Jen's thinking has evolved and experimenting, and also my own part in this. It's been very, very interesting. So that meeting in 1986 was, I would say, maybe not life altering, but it was certainly an infusion of many, many, many concepts that have become incredibly important in my life.
How did you find that Topi was received in Sweden?
Uh, well, Sweden is very, very, secular and open-minded and pretty sort of advanced. It's a good country in that way. So I never really had any like problems. I was very outspoken. I was even on TV shows and talking about sigilizing. I mean, people couldn't, understand really what I was talking about. But there I was, like a young kid.
On
Well, that,
TV?
yeah, on TV, exactly. And it
You
was just
jack
like,
off on a piece of paper and
yeah,
then
sort of. Maybe I didn't use those words, but
yeah,
of course
sure.
that was the gist of it.
Interesting.
Yeah. And also now the kinds of interviews and just letting people know that now this exists in Sweden. Also, get in touch if you're interested, and that worked. And we were very active. First, it was Topi Scandinavia, and creating. Some workshops and meetings and events and film screenings and doing the newsletter thing. And there was a Topi Scan record label. I also did videos, and then I became a little bit more, I wouldn't say corporate, but I organized things better and had another company called Psychic Release, which was also a record label and a book publishing company. So that was kind of integrated as a superstructure that produced a lot of material that sort of fed these interested people, not as a kind of a programming, but just because I was very interested in these things and I could sense that other people were too. So I think maybe the Swedish/Scandinavian environment was very, I felt it was very, very interested in these things. There were a lot of things brewing in this kind of secular part of the world.
So and also with your Psychic Release was also a publication company. You put out
Mhm,
books too, right?
mhm, mhm.
So would you say that reproducing and disseminating older magical texts was equally as important as the new ones, as creating new contexts?
Yeah, I don't know if you can ever like compare importance, but for me it was one part of Topi that I really liked was this focusing on like the occult, and I don't mean the occult in this sort of sense of a medieval magician weaving magic spells, but I mean forgotten stuff, forgotten writers and books that were simply not available, and if you could make those available to people inside Topi or outside of Topi, it doesn't matter. I felt that was an important cultural issue to keep good stuff in print in a way, and I certainly did that with some books about runology in Swedish, but it's sort of classic books on runes and runology, simply not in print, and they have never been translated to English, but yet they're great books. So I sort of published facsimile versions of those books, and there was some other stuff too. Just because I was hungry and a good book sleuth, and had some book lists that I bought stuff from, and just decided to share it. Sharing the information, that was kind of a pre-internet internet in a way.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I love the networking quality of Topi. I was a
Yeah.
part of Topi America, so
Hmm.
I was born the same year you were.
Yeah.
Your experience very much describes mine too. So
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, and also time is interesting too, because I think next year we will see the documentary, the documentary about Topi that's been in the works for many years now, and I think that's
I didn't know that.
oh yeah, no, it's um, uh, very ambitious. They've been working for many years, interviewing key people, and having found loads of archival material, of course, and it's just going to be fantastic. Message from the temple. It's
Oh
called.
yeah, nice.
Hmm.
Cool. That's
Yeah.
incredible.
So what I'm saying is that now the things that we thought, it's cool to be working with, again, the cottage industry thing, and again, little cult thing, but it has now grown into mythic stature because of the fact that, time has passed and there's a new generation who think that it's super cool. And, music usually moves in like 20-year cycles. What was popular 20 years ago tends to come back today. And so I don't know how that fits in perfectly with this thing, but I can certainly sense an interest in a generation that's just like teenagers, 20 somethings. And I can't explain it in any other way than that there's more information about Topi available. That will also change with the documentary. But I'm thinking, the publication of the Psychic Bible, I think that came out in 2009 or something like that. So that was, of course, very important, because the way it was put together as something not just like kooky, it was just like a substantial book collecting these texts that this network had produced, and it had some kind of hippie vibe or cultic vibe, as you could say. And it's just like different people all over the world formulating thoughts and ideas about this, and then it's put together in a beautiful volume, like I don't know, 20 years later. It gives it credence, and it gives it value, and it gives it sort of historical context. And there will just be more of those things. And I think this Sacred Intent book will be, I hope so, a key part in that process also, because if we focus on Jen, that is very much Jen's journey throughout these decades, and it's a magnificent journey, because it was already super interesting in 1986, and then it just grew and grew and grew, and came to integrate more and more far out things.
Yeah, and the Temple of Psychic Youth also, there was one wing of it that was sort of an art collective. There was a lot of art coming out of Topi at the time.
Oh, absolutely. And not forgetting the art that was made through the sigilizing, with the 23 sigils. That's an art collection of magical art that the world has never experienced before this. Art made with intention, again, sacred intent, if you will, strictly for individual purposes, or possibly altruistic collective purposes. I don't know, and no one cares. But the main thing is that the way one trusted the network as being custodians or guardians of this sacred art was just phenomenal. And it's not made for aesthetic purposes. It's not made to be shown or sold or anything. It's just meant to be sent out and forgotten somewhere. They exist, but the mere idea of it is phenomenal. It's like truly reclaiming the original meaning of art, which is to cause change in conformity with the will of the artist.
And time again in your book, Occulture, you see where the world of art and the occult overlap constantly.
Mm-hmm.
Why do
Mm-hmm.
you think that is?
Well, I think it's has to do with what's happening in culture at large. It's difficult when you try to talk about Western culture and Eastern culture and global culture. Those are very loose borders, boundaries in a way. But what I think is that many of these things that have to do with this particular approach, where you're consciously looking at art as causing change, usually that takes on a political form. This is like anti this or anti that, or possibly, hopefully, pro something. But then it becomes demagogic, almost like advertising or a commercial. We're used to that language from a commercial advertising point of view. But I think that the increase in, for instance, using symbols, making references to historical occultism, that comes about, as we've seen, I would say, for a good 10 years now. It's been very dominant in contemporary art. I think that it's a reaction to a world that's basically going to hell. And I don't mean the good fun hell. It's just a world gone completely havoc. And that's, of course, it's kind of a death rattle of the rational. It's a death rattle of the empirical. It's the death rattle of rigidity, of inertia. And you can say that, well, everything is in progress and stuff like that, but it's not. An exponential increase of something is not necessarily progress. It could just be inertia with a death drive. And I think that's what's happening. So all these, irrational little artists who are basically, their job is to be antennae and feel things. They react and they process this information, and what they give back is basically like, could say like a cry for help, saying we should probably look at this weird, shamanic tribe here. We should look at the alchemists of medieval times, or we should look at this tribe in Africa doing these amazing things, because that can be a way out of this I don't know, horrendous trajectory that we're on. I fear that it's not going to end well. I'm a happy person, but I'm also a dystopian, and I think that the reason why magic specifically pops up in different forms, it could be high-strung intellectual esotericism, or it could be shamanic things where you just go tripping with a drum. Doesn't really matter. You need to leave yourself, and specifically your rational thinking, because really nothing good comes out of it unless it's for implementation of good ideas. But to be a slave to the rational mind is basically not leading anywhere. So basically, I think that the resurgence or simply surgence of these thoughts and ideas within art is a reaction to the lack of it in the outside.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Another interesting flap of that would be there are a lot of overlaps between fascism and occult, the occult. What could you explain that anomaly? Why do you think that how those two seemingly disparate things find a home in each other?
Well, I think it has to do that so much in, again, I'm using Western, in our Western culture, comes from a few very dominant philosophers, and those philosophers have been seeping into not just culture and art, but also into legislation and very sort of specific parts of culture and society. And of course, our strain or our lineage basically comes from Schopenhauer, filtered via Nietzsche, and then filtered via many interpreters of Nietzsche, And the thing is that you can never escape Nietzsche and or actually Schopenhauer, but this thing where it's a philosophy of will, that's become integral in, for instance, American application of the concept of individual liberty. You have the will, you're free to do what you want to do. So that's one aspect of it, but also what do you call it, individual empowerment that's led to, for instance, women's lib, the right to vote, civil rights movement, end of apartheid. It's all about sort of empowering the individual to become a full citizen in a way. But inherent in that is that everybody potentially has a will that is sort of becoming a what do you call it, individual manifest destiny, that everybody has that potential. And the good society is the one that encourages the individual to be free and to explore and to individuate in a way. But and say so that's a process where you go from point A, where you say, I don't know what I want, and then you come to point B. Whoa, now I know what I want, and here's point C. This is where I want to go because that's what I want. So everybody has some kind of individual trajectory. That's the basis for Western thinking and culture. However, if that's again with an American lingo, you could say that, well, there you have it. I want to be the best I can be. I want to transcend myself. I want to transgress my problems and the things that hinder me. and just bloom. And that could be expressed like that in a poetic, floral language. I want to bloom and be beautiful in my life. But if you apply the same thing on with a different language, it could also be expressed like, I'm gonna do my will, and I don't care who stands in my way. I'll just thrash them. That's a different. It might be the same attitude, but it's a different approach. The main so in the way that these like libertarian stuff and fascism, all these things are expressed in different terminologies, but there is one main divider where one thing is, to me, good and the other thing is bad, and that is how pure is the encouragement of the individuation process? Is it enough that the individual is free, and is it sort of valid for everyone within a society? That's what I call like a good application of the philosophy of will. In the bad one, you have a sort of a need for a collective subservience, because some few people are allowed to individuate and be the best they can be, and they usually enforce something that it was called, well, let's call it imposed stratification. Imposed stratification doesn't exist in nature, but it does in, for instance, fascist societies, where you have rules saying what you can do and can't do based on what those above will allow you to do, and saying that people who look like this, they are not entitled to the same liberties as those who look like us. And there you have it. Both are imbued with with the philosophy of will and the positive things that can bring. But if you don't want to share that approach with absolutely everybody, then it could be called some kind of fascist approach. Because it's usually confused, when people talk about fascism, it's usually confused with this sort of, the longing for the Superman in a way. But the longing for the Superman is actually a beautiful thing. It only becomes bad when you have this collectivistic thing saying that a few of us are Superman, everybody else is subhuman. They need to be stomped upon or despised. But that's something completely different. That's actually sort of showing your own non-individuation, because in an individuation process that has any value, you realize that we may not all be the same, and maybe that's a good thing too. But this should be enough for me to deal with myself. I don't need to thrash anyone else. That cannot elevate me in a substantial way. It's impossible. Basically, I think that people should just mind their own business. That's the good.
I agree, absolutely. It seems like in the history of sort of secret magical orders too, there's a sort of an elitism, like an inclusivity, I should say. No, exclusivity. That's what I mean. I always get
Exclusivity.
those
Yeah.
two mixed up.
Yeah.
Where it's secret knowledge, only the initiated can have access to it. That's one of the things that I liked about Topi, is they made all of that stuff open to everybody. I mean, sure, there were, the more intimately involved you were with Topi, the more access you got to different things, but it didn't have the same sort of hierarchical BS that a lot of the other stuff had.
Yeah, no, not at all. And I think that I think the again, if you talk about stratification, the stratification came from being involved. To what extent were you involved in this? And it didn't necessarily have to do with showing up and helping arranging meetings and stuff like that. It could equally well be done a commitment to the whole, to the entirety, by doing the sigils on the 23rd, for instance. That was something you did for yourself. So in individual work, yet it benefited the totality and the sort of collective energy by showing trust to the process that basically each and every one was a part of formulating.
Yeah, I that's and I where are all of those sigils located? Are they all in one place now?
No, globally, no. I would say that the ones that I took care of, sort of, they are in a safe place.
In a
Yeah,
safety
yeah.
deposit box in the bottom of the ocean?
No, but they're in a safe place, absolutely,
Yeah, yeah.
and they're well respected and not looked at. They're
Yeah,
just
sure.
stashed away and generating some kind of post Topi or pre new Topi energy. I don't know.
You should put them in an orgone accumulator.
Yeah, yeah, no, but seriously, I mean, people, who were involved, marginally or just heard about it, they thought that's such a weird thing to do, aestheticize your desire and use your again organic energy to vitalize it. It's sounds like I think to most people like. The magical thinking of kids in a way,
Mhm.
but it was certainly valid. And then again, uh, it is kind of a different thing, if I were to do it and you were to do it, then we're two goofy guys experimenting with magical concepts. But what if hundreds of people are doing this more or less synced on the same date every month, and isn't that the most amazing art? And it has nothing to do with what it looks like. There are no aesthetic givens. There are no aesthetic prerequisites for it to be successful. The success of the sigilizing process lies in a programming of the individual by the individual, and that it takes an exterior form that you could say is aestheticized is completely besides the point. That's something for the creator, and that sort of is a completely different approach to postmodernism, for instance, where Duchamp said that it's in the interaction with the viewer that the art really fulfills its meaning and has a value in that sense. But this is sort of the opposite. We don't need an audience for this art to be magical art, thereby actually real valuable art.
Agreed. Yeah, I can only imagine. I was visiting Tom Headbanger
Mhm.
in Denver many, many, many years ago, and I just happened to see a file cabinet with a drawer open with that stuff in there, and I just glanced at it, and I was like, "Oh my God,
Yeah.
there's a lot going on there."
Yeah, absolutely. And this, I mean, it was interesting to see also that although there were recommendations for what to include and how to do it, it was still kind of a happy-go-lucky, very free-floating experimental attitude. So there are a lot of different styles. Not everybody did exactly the same thing, because that would have been sort of against the ideals in a way. So it was interesting. And speaking of Tom, for instance, Tom. I arranged together with my wife a conference in northern Italy last spring, and Tom was there, and also Koshka from Topi US, talking about the kind of a initiatory process of being involved with Topi at that time, and that will be part. That will be a chapter for Fenris Wolf. 11, Fenris Wolf 11. And Fenris Wolf, also my journal, it's also a remnant from that time. I started the Fenris Wolf way back in Topi times,
Mhm.
and then up until 93 with the first 3 issues, and then I sort of resumed much later, 2011, and now it's almost an annual thing. And the Fenris Wolf keeps that very, very eclectic Topi fire burning in a way.
Is there an online presence for Fenris Wolf?
Well, not in the sense that there's a website with information about it, but I have it on the Trapar website. My company now, Trapar, has all the issues and information about them there. I can send you those links.
Please do, and I'll
Yeah.
include them in the show
Hmm.
notes.
Yeah, yeah.
Going back briefly to the fascism occult overlap, even in the circle of psychic TV and all the music that was being made at that time in England,
Hmm.
there were groups like Death in June
Hmm.
and Current 93. Some of Current 93, they sort of flirted with that
Hmm.
fascistic imagery. What do you think that? Do you have any idea where the origins of that connection were?
Well, I think it's always been around in avant-garde music, and I'm not meaning like scholastic academic music, but I mean just like avant-garde, cool music in a way. You know, people accuse David Bowie of that, and Marilyn Manson, and you know all kinds of stuff using symbols here and there. But I mean, of course, there's a difference between being someone like Current 93, which is basically like a romantic poet weaving in things from aesthetic bits here and aesthetic bits there, but he's basically a romantic poet in a way, whereas the other group you mentioned is so clearly not only sniffing but actually infatuated with an era that led to devastation for a large part of the civilized world. And also very bad music, I have to say. So in that sense, I can't find any explanations why. I mean, why are people attracted to things that are horrendous and disastrous and totally counterproductive to what they claim to be interested in, is like becoming a much more elevated and efficient and great human being. And if you want to apply that fantasy to like your own kin or your own race or whatever, it's you haven't really studied history. It's just, it never works. It never. And again, what we talked about in the beginning is that the human dynamic will fuck everything up. You can have the highest, loftiest, most racist ideals, and it will be completely fucked up because it's humans.
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
human individuals, I should add. Even the Nazi regime and all that stuff. There was no homogeneity there. There was no adherence to lofty principles. They were just corrupt individuals, trying to secure their own power. Not unlike the situation we have today in the good old USA.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what is your take on Marina Abramovic and her occult inclusion of occult aesthetics in her art? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I am, and I think that I've never been a real fan. I have a little respect for her. I think she's a genuine artist and stuff. But the thing is that she stems from an era, or from era is perhaps, but she stems from a time when there was a lot of dramatic things and changes going on in performance art specifically. And Genesis also comes from that time with Coombe Transmissions and Throbbing Gristle, and there was Stellark and Chris Burden, many people doing very like aggressive performances, poetic yet aggressive, often dealing with the human body. And of course the Viennese action artists with Hermann Nietzsche, and it's just like again, reactive art that was reactive against like the what do you call it, what happened after the Second World War, how people interpreted what had happened, and that drift was seeping into this new generation that either had like a bad conscience for what their fathers and mothers had done, been involved with, or they were perhaps victims. So no one was untouched by this thing. And I think again, when an artist explores kind of extreme things, which they were, maybe also the pendulum swings so that it's not only physical, tangible expressions, but they also feel the same need to go inside or go into the history of human inside, and basically the history of ideas, and see what's there that they can use that also evokes a strong reaction in themselves or in their audience. So I think that in her case, I've never had any vibes of her being genuinely interested in anything, you know, occult in this kind of transformative way. I think she's very much an artist's artist. She's very mental and intellectual and deciding on what to integrate. But then again, I don't know her, so I haven't had those vibes that she was, that she's more interested in these things than anyone else.
Sure, sure. Well, you also in the book you have a chapter on Anton LaVey,
Mm-hmm.
old Anton. Were you guys friends? Did you? Were you?
Yeah, yeah, and that's basically. It's funny that you ask that because right this evening, actually last evening. I mean,
Uh,
I'm in the evening, you're in the
yes.
afternoon right now.
Uh,
Last evening there was the American premiere of my documentary about Anton LaVey
oh
called
wow.
called Into the Devil's Den, and I'm very proud of that film. It's definitely the best thing I've ever done, and it has potential for outreach because it's like a feature length documentary film. And last night it was premiered in the U.S. At the 50th. Anniversary of the publication of the Satanic Bible.
Oh wow. How
It's like,
fantastic.
yeah, it's amazing. Amazing. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there
Uh-huh.
except for via the film. But so yeah, we were friends. I knew him between 1989 and up until his death. And I went there every year up until 1993, I think. So we hung out, and he was very supportive of what I was doing and very inspiring and sort of influential in that sense that gave me a sense of not only carrying on and doing these encouraging me to go with my interests and my intuitions and really research things properly, but also to create all these things that I was already creating, but it gave me a boost to take it to new levels.
Mhm. So, I mean, do you think that the Church of Satan was a sort of a legitimate occult organization, or more just a gathering of piss takers?
Well, both, I'd say. The
Yeah,
one
yeah,
doesn't necessarily need to exclude the other.
that's
I
true.
think that one thing that I'm trying to, what do you call it, get rid of in my film is this thing where people are just saying the same thing. Say he's a con man, he was just a charlatan, la da da. It means nothing, and these people have usually they don't know anything. So basically, in the film, I'm interviewing people who knew him at about around the same time that I was there, and it's very interesting. We had many similar experiences, and all of them, acknowledge that he was not only deeply interested, but that he was actually a magician's magician. And I certainly think so, because the chapter in the Occulture book that you refer to is also my sitting down and thinking, what was actually in this? And it was towards the end of his life. I mean, it's exactly the same time that when I was there. Um, when he was officially a kind of a recluse. I don't know what that means. He was still seeing some people, but he worked more on writing these sometimes aphorisms or short essays. And when you look at them, you scratch the surface and go beyond the little the humorous, and you just find out, whoa, there's so much substance here, and there's so much of concepts that have nothing to do with this medieval kabbalistic Western angelic John Dee stuff, whatever. It's just to the point, based in human psychology and a knowledge of human psychology, and it works. It works. It creates results in the people who try to implement his ideas into praxis, and it's kind of remarkable. And that's one thing that I loved about Topi, I loved about LaVey, is that they were concocting something new, not even necessarily out of something old. They were just, revving it up and formulating these ideas that have since been very, very inspiring for other people. It's fantastic.
Do you think that the Temple of Satan currently kind of is sort of continuing to carry that torch, or do you think it's a whole new beast?
Um, Again, both, because there's always the danger, when a strong leader passes, that there's nothing left. But I think what's happened since the current leaders, took over and sort of took their time to create a stable beast, and I think it's obviously being very successful in the sense that uh, their members are producing a lot of stuff that has, um, what do you call it, outreach and tangibility, and it's a good cultural environment. And that's the key, of course, to any movement or any group that wants to have longevity. You have to focus on culture. Everything else is kind of redundant. So I would say, yeah, I think they're doing a great job. and it's very different, and it's much more, stressing perhaps, the atheistic aspects of the philosophy, and yet at the same time, encouraging people to deal with the bullshit that they're exposed to.
Yeah, I just found out something recently about them that was I have mixed feelings about, but they sort of had this campaign to try and discredit psychiatrists who deal with people who claim to be victims of satanic ritual abuse. And I thought that that was an interesting sort of undertaking for them to do, because it seems like, and they're doing it very fervently too. It seems like the ferocity with which they're approaching that campaign almost implicates them in a way. Like, I would never think to link those two things up together, but
Mm.
their fervency is like, well, why are you so passionate about disproving this?
Yeah, but again, I mean, I'm not sort of knowledgeable about the details of these things, but I think that maybe if it's also could be like a proactive kind of thing, if you don't address certain issues with vigor or perhaps even aggression, then they could come back to bite you in the ass later on. It's the same thing, when people start chewing on certain, individual liberties in legislation and stuff like that. If you don't attack it right away, then the same termites will just keep on chewing on individual liberty. Again, that's going on a pretty high level in the US today. So again, I don't know the details of what you're referring to, but I would say that this thing with the satanic panics and stuff like that, they come and go. And they come and go with generational things. I remember in the 80s, that was quite, a dominant thing, specifically in the UK, but also in the US. And I mean, that withered away when all of these fake people, fake victims that had been so thoroughly debunked, so thoroughly humiliated in media. And I think that when that withers away, then someone else will use the same thing to make a buck, unfortunately. But it's just, so I think it's part of being vigilant and proactive.
So you don't think that?
That's just my suspicion.
Sure. You don't suspect that there's any sort of mass abuse going on, whether by Satanists or not.
No. Well, if there's mass abuse, it's certainly within the Catholic Church. Then,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're close to the end of the time, but I've got just a couple more
yeah,
questions if
sure,
you're all
yeah,
right with that.
yeah.
You did in Occulture, you have a chapter that's on dreams, and
Mm-hmm.
you seem to, the way that you portrayed it in the chapter, seem to portray dreams as something almost passive, like you're watching something that's provided for you.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, do you have any place, or have you ever experienced lucid dreaming?
I have, and I'm not sure that I would agree with your description, or maybe I haven't read that chapter in a long time, so I don't know. But the thing is, the way I look at it is that I see both sleeping and specifically dreaming as being perhaps more crucial than being awake. And I've often, when I've thought about these things, it's not something I think about 24/7. But when I sit down and sort of think about it from a philosophical point of view, I often come to the conclusion that it's in the dreaming and the sleeping that things really happen that are of value, and that what we're doing now is that we're mentally exhausting ourselves by talking, and so that we can go to sleep and dream, and that we work all day long and exercise the bodies and stuff like that, so we can go sleep and dream. That, and also creating, making money to create sustenance and a safe surrounding to sleep in. It's very easy to flip that, not the switch, but to change the perspective. Um, and that, I think that was what I was after in terms of looking at these things. And then I would say, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's like transmission from some higher forces. I think it is an intercommunication uh, with ourselves on an individual level. But of course, we are also, and there I would agree with LaVey, we're animals. We're living in our biosphere. It's a very harsh and cold biosphere out here with cement and stuff like that. But still, so we can get messages from our surroundings in dreams too. That everybody knows that, and I think that again, we are all geared for survival. So the stuff that's happening in the dreams is basically messages about how we should act, interact. Not necessarily from some god or some gods or higher forces. It's just like, going through the machinery of this very intelligent animal.
Makes absolute sense. Yeah.
Mm.
And it seems like, some dreams are so vivid, it is almost like you are on a different plane of existence. You're in a
Mhm.
different reality altogether.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, one of the most intelligent and sort of potentially painful questions there are for human beings is that why the hell can't I remember more of my dreams? Because, we all ascribe something to it. Some people say, it's just residue. But if you ascribe some kind of value to it, they say, oh, I just wish I could remember more of my dreams so that I could, enjoy them more. But then again, maybe that's not the way it's supposed to be. Maybe it's just that this kind of analysis that's going on in us when we're sleeping and dreaming, maybe that's just a different kind of level, a different kind of language that we in our puny waking state cannot fathom or understand.
Exactly. Like some
Again,
drug.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, if you change the perspective and say what we're doing now is perhaps not half as lucid as what we'll experience in dream time. Maybe you and I will have a conversation in dream time too. Who
Let's do
knows?
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
You put the SD card in my neck and record it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
All too soon. All too
Yeah.
soon. So do you have any sort of current magical practice that you do? Are you doing meditation or?
Yeah, I try to, but I have to say is that I've been working on these things. I don't know what that means. I've been working in this mind frame for a long time, and I've tried various things out, and some things work better than others. But I can't escape the fact that what it all boils down to is what you do. You cannot see these things as being specific in a certain space in a certain time, meaning the classical way of looking at ritual, like you go into a temple space and you do a ritual to achieve something. I have done that and occasionally still do that, but that's basically more like a pit stop, or you stop and fill up some gas in the car, or whatever. But mainly, what happens is that I am now in a position because of diligent and focused work where I can work with the things that I love to work with every day, all of the day, and that in itself is, of course, a result of magical processes, but it is a magical process in itself. And what I'm doing is ritual in on this day-to-day basis. I'm working now on the Sacred Intent book. The film about LaVey premiered yesterday in the US, and I've plenty of new films and new books to work on. So I cannot see. I was going to say it will never end. Of course, it will end when I die. But I think for the rest of my life, I have enough projects to deal with, and more just come up. So in that sense, I think my praxis in terms of uh, ritual and magic, it's basically what I do. It's my work because it's all imbued also. I wouldn't say with demagogia, but everything has some kind of, hopefully inspirational value in the work. Whether it's a documentary about some historical person, or whether it's a novel, or whether it's a book about something, it doesn't matter. It contains that, hopefully, it's a Promethean inspiration, where people who read it become inspired and say, "Yeah, I'm gonna deal with my life in a different way now." So in that sense, there is a strong sense of um, magic in what I do.
I mean, the Buddhists talk about turning everything into a meditation.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's
yeah.
sort of the same thing. Yeah.
It is the same thing.
It's just an awareness that you bring to it.
Hmm.
So where can we see the Anton LaVey documentary? Is it going to be online or?
It is online. It is online on my Vimeo on demand page, and I will certainly send you a link to
Please
that.
do.
And it's well, it's Vimeo is easy. It's readily available, and of course, people who are not who can't go to these odd screenings, because right now it's just going to be like festivals and odd screenings here and there.
Mhm.
And I hope to perhaps have it on some kind of streaming service someday. But for now, it's Vimeo on demand, and it works well. And I've received a lot of great, accolades or kudos, and people seem to really love the film, and I'm very, very happy about that, of course.
Excellent. And where can people go to check out all the stuff that you do?
Well, I think the best things is a lot of things are about making tangible things, whether it's books or anything. I've collected all of that stuff under the umbrella of Trapar, and I'll send you a link to that also. That's a book publishing company, but we also do art editions, and just today we released. Like a CD, but it's a box, so it's more like art than just a CD. And it's just again the cottage industry thing never ends. It's just endless, a lot of products and stuff. So yeah, I would say that people should go to Vimeo on demand and then check out Trapar also.
Okay, and both of those links will be in the liner notes. Make
You
sure
bet.
and get them to me.
I will do that, absolutely.
All right, Carl, thank you so much for taking the time to speak.
Yeah, thank you. It was wonderful.
Yes.
And let's talk again sometime.
Absolutely. Maybe when the book with Jen interviews comes out.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's scheduled to be released on February 22nd next year. That's Jen's 70th birthday.
Fantastic. And what is that? What publishing house is that coming out of?
That's coming out on Trapar. That's my
on
own
Trapar.
publishing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. All roads lead to Trapar.
Every road leads to Trapar. Yes.
Okay. All right.
But no one ever leaves.
You leave your soul behind with the mission.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Carl.
Thank
Let's do it again in the future.
Yep.
Have a good rest of your evening.
Yep. Thanks very much. Bye.
That was a very enjoyable and informative conversation. Carl is a great historian about all things occult and the various contexts in which it has appeared throughout history, some of them dark and ominous, some of them very positive and forward-moving and progressive. And it was just fascinating to sort of read all of that, the vast manifestations of the occult in different contexts, all in one cover, all in one book, rather. And Carl did an excellent job of putting all that together. And actually, it's a sort of a compilation of different essays and lectures that he has given throughout the last few years. And it was really good, a really good read. I highly recommend it. There will be a link to the Inner Traditions website where you can buy that. And also will be included the links that Carl brought up there towards the end. Just look in the liner notes and all that will be there. I would like to thank you all so much for listening, and I would like to take this moment to ask you to consider maybe helping out a little bit with the podcast. I, at this point, am dead against having any advertisers because I just don't like listening to a podcast where I have to fast forward through the first 9 minutes. Even though Duncan Trussell's commercials on his podcast are very entertaining, I don't think that I could match that if I were to do the same thing. I don't want people to have to fast forward through the first 9 minutes, nor do I want to interrupt the content with a commercial in between, nor do I want the compromise that might accompany having said advertisers. I don't want that to have any influence on what I put out on my podcast. So that's another reason not to do that. So the model that I'm adopting now is basically asking people to go through Patreon. www.patreon.com/themeltpodcast is where you can find my Patreon page. The link will also be in the episode notes. And you can go there, and for as little as $1 per month, what the hell can you get for $1 these days? Anyway, maybe a Tootsie Pop sucker? I have no idea. That's probably over $1 at this point anyway. For as little as $1 per month, you can have access to video versions of some of the interviews. In the future, I'm going to include some mini documentaries and video things that I'm going to post on there too. And sometimes I post episodes there, the video versions, before the audio versions are released on the website. But above and beyond all of that, I don't want to have to put a carrot in front of anybody's face. I want people to help out because it's something that they believe in, and they want to feel good about supporting an endeavor that I'm trying to do, which is basically bring conversations about these things to the public, destigmatize the discussion of such matters, and basically spread ideas and start conversations. And I eventually want to have a place on my website where there is a forum where people can communicate with each other or comment on the episodes that are posted there. Because I do think that these conversations are very important. I think the consideration of the things that are discussed during this podcast are wonderful to entertain, if not inform the way that we interact with each other and the world at large, and the universe for that matter. If we're going to keep expanding our contexts, it's all interconnected anyway, right? So yeah, www.patreon.com/themeltpodcast is where you can find that. The links to my Facebook page and all the other places where my data is being harvested are in the episode notes too. And you can also send ideas for guests to themeltpodcast@gmail.com. You can also comment there. And if you have any ideas for topics to cover, I'm wide open. And also, this is what I temporarily forgot. Also, I am open to receiving people's stories or testimony about experiences that they've had with the kinds of things that I talk about on this show. Any experience that goes outside of the realm of consensus reality. And there are many, and there's a plethora of them. And I want to revere the importance of firsthand experiences that can't be duplicated in a scientific context or a laboratory. Often these things happen, and they happen so suddenly and out of the blue or spontaneously that they're hard to document. Often they happen at night. Hard to document that too. And a lot of these things are either one of a kind occurrences, or they're unique to a particular context or situation, and they're just not readily duplicatable. Is that the right way of saying that? So they evade the realm of scientism, which is the religion of the day. Believe it or not. I mean, it really is. It really is a religion. If you put all of your eggs in the basket of science, then sure, that covers a lot of territory, but only science is limited too. And when we start rigidifying, am I just making up my own dictionary here? I mean, language is malleable anyway, right? What was I saying? When we start looking towards something that is supposed to be as open-minded as science, and thinking that if science hasn't grasped it or wrapped its mind around it, then it doesn't exist, or it's not even worthy of speculation, then that's a problem. That's a problem. Anything that keeps us in a particular place, like thinking that we've got everything figured out and that there's nothing left to explore, that is highly negative and destructive. So I think it's very important to have an open mind, and that's what I am trying to foster here on The Melt, with having these conversations about things that you might think are kooky or crazy, but hey, hopefully they at least get your mind gears working and have you thinking in different ways, or thinking of different possibilities. All right. Again, thank you all so much for listening. It's very much appreciated. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, all of that malarkey. And I highly encourage you to either spread the word wherever you spread your words, or give it a rating or a review on any of those platforms. It would be highly appreciated. It's the only way that this thing is going to get outside of a small group of people huddled over a burning trash can on a dock somewhere. And stay tuned. There's a lot of great stuff coming up. I've got episodes booked through April, and every one of them is compelling and looks to be wonderful. I can't wait to talk to these people and can't wait to share it with you. So thank you again. Until next time, take care.